Recording in progress. Thank you. So sometimes it's when there are evacuations, folks will have no control over where they're going. They may not know how long they'll go. I'd point to a document from Texas Housers detailing an evacuation in Galveston, Texas, of a PHA building that was quite chaotic, and folks, like, for instance, left medication behind. They weren't sure how long they'd be gone. They don't know where they were going and that sort of thing. So it's an issue there. There may be discrimination at emergency shelters against people with disabilities, against non-white individuals. There may be not enough shelters to take care of folks with special needs. They may not be prepared to host live-in care assistants that are not related to the individual and that sort of thing. In addition, there's disruption of support networks, as well as police and the Department of Homeland Security play a large role in all of these things, which for folks that have never had or do not have a good relationship with either of those organizations, that creates a risk there that either they will not seek assistance, or if they, those folks will not do their best to reach out to those communities that they consistently over police and that sort of thing. And in addition, curfews affect individuals experiencing homelessness. Cool. Cool. So after the emergency response phase, FEMA comes in, or will have approved what they call, will have approved both public assistance and individual assistance. Public assistance is a reimbursement program for states and local governments to have their disaster expenses reimbursed by the federal government, typically at 75% of cost. And that can be for emergency work or permanent work dealing with the impacts of the disasters, of a disaster. And then there's individual assistance, which is assistance to individuals. And typically when NLIHC talks about individual assistance, we're talking about it through the Individuals and Households program. And that program includes housing assistance and other needs assistance. Housing assistance can take a variety of forms. Might be direct temporary housing units or FEMA trailers, as they have been called in the past. Then there's also other needs assistance, which is like reimbursement for medical care costs and child care costs and that sort of thing. So it all sounds pretty rosy, right? It sounds like there's a lot of resources there, but there's often quite a lot of eligibility issues. And one example of kind of an eligibility issue at FEMA is how they categorize folks that were experiencing homelessness prior to a disaster. You'd have, they split it up, and I've never really seen this at another agency. They split up individuals that are experiencing homelessness and residents of non-traditional housing, which qualifies folks living in, a tent or a hut or a lean-to structure. So individuals that are experiencing homelessness are not eligible for housing assistance at all, pretty much. They can get some costs reimbursed, but again, it's reimbursement, so it's not necessarily the most effective or beneficial program for somebody already living on the street. And they differentiate that from somebody that is residing in a non-traditional structure like a tent, where if verified by a credible source, they could get individual rental assistance. So typically what happens is an individual that was experiencing homelessness prior to a disaster just is not eligible for FEMA assistance at all, typically. And there's a variety of other eligibility issues that we'll get into. I think it's probably 2 slides from now, but I did just want to talk about why eligibility and why FEMA assistance is so important. And it's because of the greater scarcity of rental housing created by a disaster. So you have, multiple factors increasing the scarcity of rental housing, not even talking about affordable housing now, it's just rental housing in general. Because you have a large portion of the existing rental stock damaged during a disaster. And then you also have higher income homeowners moving to rental housing when their homes are damaged or so damaged that they cannot continue living there. And that leads to greater inaccessibility. Of course, it's higher rents due to rent gouging by landlords. It slows the recovery down because that's lack of workforce housing for recovery workers that are attempting to live in the area so that they can assist in the rebuilding. And then there's also a severe, lack of accessible housing for individuals living with disabilities that have special needs in terms of what housing that they can actually live in. And basically the effect of this is displacement and an increase in homelessness. And obviously, as you could tell from the previous slide, existing inequality has a direct impact on that housing recovery. So if you're in a location that is really already in the crisis mode in terms of affordable housing, you're already going to be suffering even more in terms of the lack of housing stock, and housing recovery will go all the more slower. And then in addition to that, and we'll get into this in a little bit, but unequal patterns of infrastructure maintenance and modernization means that lower income communities frequently have outdated infrastructure. They have lack of access to banks, food, emergency services. They rely on public transit that may be destroyed or knocked out of service by a disaster, as well as a poor relationship with law enforcement officers and other government entities. So it really makes it all the more frustrating when sorry, I skipped ahead a little bit here and we'll come back to those, but it makes it all the more frustrating when you do have FEMA FEMA individual assistance programs that have so many cracks in it that folks fall through, and they fall through via, documentation requirements, where, for many years, FEMA was requiring title documents to be provided to them in order for individuals to prove that they own their own home. The application itself is very convoluted. Access to translated materials may not be available. The process requires you to have your home directly inspected by a FEMA inspector, which means you need to either be on the premises or have somebody in the area that can let that inspector in. The inspectors themselves can not be familiar with certain types of housing that are often utilized as low-income housing, like manufactured homes or multifamily homes. And for even those folks that do get through the application process and do receive assistance from FEMA, that assistance is usually very short-lived. It's usually not enough. We'll typically, it's just by far not enough for any person to fully recover from there if they're low income, if they are living with low incomes going into that. Sorry, I just wanted to touch on that because we're doing that. Going back to this, I wanted to talk about the displacement section of this population loss down at the bottom of this slide. And I wanted to do that just by talking about the Camp Fire here, which was a destructive blaze in Northern California that entirely destroyed the town of Paradise, California. And this was a very cool study put together by CSU Chico, talking about where folks were displaced to. And as you can see, it's basically the folks with the higher incomes were able to move directly closest to where they had previously lived. Individuals with lower incomes were forced to move well beyond where they had previously resided. And what this means is that individuals are being severed from their support network, both their mental and, mental, spiritual, familial networks, as well as their, more economic support networks and that sort of thing. So what that does is, in between the chaos of the disaster and the chaos of attempting to reestablish your own support network in an area that you may not be fully familiar with, it's exceptionally traumatizing and makes it even less likely that you'll achieve a full recovery, which is why it is so frustrating that FEMA does have, those FEMA programs do have such a gap there for folks that are living with low incomes. Sherry, I gotcha. Sorry, I'm looking through the comments real quick. And Ariadna, I have a moment to talk about data later on. Let me talk about CDBG. Yeah, let me get to CDBGDR and then we can do the whole thing. But again, this is kind of ideally what we'd like FEMA to do, which is to quickly ensure that housing strategies can be deployed, ensure that those strategies make sense for the area, ensure that housing assistance is proportional between homeowners, renters, and individuals experiencing homelessness, ensure that short-term housing is accessible to individuals living with disabilities, and so on. And additionally, this is some short-term recovery issues here. Kind of talked about a lot of these. Yeah, kind of talking about FEMA reforms. These are just some like broader overviews of it. That's cool. Like focus on this. But I also wanted to talk about just two kind of pushes that we've been up to, what we've been up to at NLIHC on this issue. First off would be the Disaster Housing Assistance Program, or DHAP, which would provide temporary rental assistance. It's portable, has wraparound counseling. And then in addition, this Housing Survivors of Major Disasters Act, which would cement in statute a lot of the reforms that we just saw from FEMA over this past summer. It addresses issues around property documentation and titling, allowing individuals that obviously own their own home but do not have title to those homes to successfully apply for FEMA assistance and utilize the self-declarative statement, or the declarative statement that was actually kind of first synthesized by some folks in Texas and then used to great effect by our friends in Puerto Rico, because as some may know that folks in Puerto Rico, or the system of land ownership in Puerto Rico often does not employ titles, and FEMA was not aware of that when they set up their entire assistance program in Puerto Rico. And so it resulted in the denial of what, 70,000, more than that, folks in Puerto Rico for disaster assistance, and kind of forcing legal aid attorneys to turn to a self-declarative statement so that folks could attest to the ownership of their homes. Is that right, Ariadna? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
completely right. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So getting into CDBG-DR, and by CDBG-DR, I mean the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, or CDBG-DR for short. And when you can say that 5 times fast, they let you be a disaster recovery advocate. So CDBG-DR is the only source for longer term disaster recovery funds from the federal government. So you listened to me prattle on about FEMA just now. FEMA is kind of on the shorter end. Statutorily, their assistance can only go for 18 months following the disaster. So this is long-term funds that are meant to kind of address the remaining kind of direct impacts after FEMA leaves town, and then those indirect effects, which are like the loss of housing stock in the area, population movements, maybe a change in industry if certain natural resources have been destroyed and that sort of thing. But of course, we're talking about it because I work at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. We view this as a strong source for quite a lot of new construction as well as rehabilitation funds. And most notably, it's also funds that can go to assisting individuals experiencing homelessness, both folks that were experiencing homelessness before the disaster as well as afterwards. And it's very complicated, and I could probably spend another hour or so talking about it, but or talking about all the like nitty gritty details of it. But suffice to say that it is difficult to fully administer. And we'll talk a little bit more about that just in a second. I just wanted to briefly also touch on CDBG MIT, which is CDBG mitigation funds, which are kind of similar to CDBG-DR, but they do not have to be directly connected to a disaster impact. They can look at kind of the future impacts of a disaster. So I kind of looking at CDBG-DR, so it's long-term recovery funds. It's typically pretty large. What happens is Congress will approve a large chunk of funds, typically, every couple years for the last several years of disasters in terms of CDBG, DR funding, and HUD will divvy those funds up and send them out. And typically they're fairly large amounts. And they have such a wide variety of uses, which is bad because, local government sometimes has a tendency to utilize those funds to like renovate the strip mall that they've been wanting to renovate for quite some time, instead of, addressing the impact of the disaster or future impacts of a disaster. But in a good way, it's flexible enough that you can really kind of get at some of this infrastructure segregation that you see. So this is a map of Houston, Texas. And more specifically, it's a map of the open ditch service areas in Houston, Texas, which is kind of is what it sounds like. It's a ditch on the side of the road that catches the water that hits the impervious surface of the road and ideally takes the water away. Now, this is overlaid here. It's the little black dots that are overlaid around it. And the green color are areas with 95% or more minority groups in those, I believe these are census block tracts. So as you can see, where they are utilizing open ditch drainage are predominantly non-white communities. And that's important because ditches on the side of the road are typically not the most advanced way that we can deal with rainwater, with wastewater and that sort of thing. And as a result, flooding is increased, damage is increased to surrounding homes. And, the result is a decrease of community cohesion, abandoned homes, and a wide variety of things, especially like even just like individual suffering and additional financial pains. So what CDBG-DR can do is attempt to elevate this. We can utilize that to get out of this pattern of discrimination that pops up in many cities across the country. And that's kind of something that a disaster kind of presents to us, is an opportunity to utilize some of these funds to actually get at the root causes, not the root causes of the inequality, but some of the base results of that inequality in terms of where we live, what do we live around, and how we are living. So you remember I said the CDBG-DR process is complicated. This is the process by which CDBG-DR funds get from Congress through to a disaster survivor. Well, not even that, but gets to a state so that it can be distributed to a disaster survivor. And if it looks complicated, that's because it is. And all of this takes time, and all of this exists because the program is not permanently authorized. So basically, it only exists when Congress passes money for the program, which means each time Congress passes funds for the program, HUD has to go through and rewrite all of the regulations and policies for the program. A state has to read the new regulations and policies for the program, create a action plan or a proposal for the use of the funds, have public comment periods submitted to HUD. HUD will approve or reject. HUD will sign, ideally will sign a grant agreement, and then states can access the funds. And if there's any issues or delays in here, it all has a rippling effect that will result in, I think on average this process takes like 6 years or something. So you're looking at 6 years after a disaster actually receiving these funds. As I said, yeah, it's lengthy. The requirements vary each time, so it's hard to anticipate it. And in addition, there's a lack of oversight for grantees. I think our friends in Texas and Puerto Rico would most heartily agree with this lack of oversight, in that, just this past week, HUD found that there were civil rights issues there was civil rights violations in Texas's General Land Office's mitigation plans, its plans for this CDBG mitigation money. HUD is kind of poised to approve their plan regardless of that fact, because it is such a flexible program and it is disaster recovery money. And so there's a pressure on all involved to get these funds out, whether it's in an equitable fashion or not. You have some substantive oversight issues. And in addition, because the program itself isn't permanently authorized, I think HUD can sometimes feel like its hands are tied in terms of really ensuring that fair housing obligations are being followed, that equities, that programs are equitable, that civil rights laws are truly being followed and not just being followed on paper. And then in addition, there's massive amounts of capacity issues for smaller grantees, where you might have somebody, you might have a jurisdiction that's managing funds that are like double or triple the size of its entire yearly budget, and doing that after a disaster as well. So there's a lot of issues here that would be assisted if only the program was permanently authorized. So that's just kind of some takeaways here on equity during long-term recovery. Take a sip of water here. And this is what I was talking about. This is legislation that would permanently authorize the CDBG-DR program, and it would also create a a base level framework for equity within that program to ensure that resources are going to folks that are the most in need, that funds are being spent proportional between homeowners and renters, that there's some transparency, data transparency and oversight, as well as kind of beefs up some of the mitigation and resiliency issues so that, homes are not just being rebuilt just to be damaged again by a disaster. So a note on data, because this is a good point to pause here to talk a little bit about data. So there's data. CDBG-DR utilizes FEMA data, which, as we earlier saw, does not actually, FEMA application and acceptance data does not actually reflect where there is the most need in terms of disaster recovery. But CDBG-DR, for lack of any other data, has to utilize that FEMA data when they're making decisions about where to send recovery funds. So it's, already a bad, that's why, again, FEMA eligibility is such an important issue on this topic. And then in addition, researchers need specific data to fully analyze equity. Civil rights attorneys need specific data to fully analyze equity of these programs, but the data is not either not being collected or the data is not accessible by the general public. And so when that data is not accessible or not collected, it's very, very difficult to do the kind of arithmetic necessary to figure out where the greatest needs are and where there are people directly being left behind by all of these disaster recovery programs. And then in addition, there's a lack of access to publicly personally identifiable information or PII data. Lots of other agencies such as HUD have the ability, or research institutions have the ability to access PII data under certain circumstances in basically quite a lot of agencies, save for FEMA. There's no actual way, or if there is a way, it's often very, very controlled, very difficult to utilize under the current kind of scope of data sharing that FEMA has, which is very nebulous. And so it's also important that these research institutions get a chance to analyze this PII data in such a way as to ensure that equity is, that all of these programs are being applied equitably, because I know they're not, but I don't necessarily, sometimes I don't have the data to fully show that they're not being conducted equitably. So I'll just say because we're almost done, I'm just going to plow on through here to the end, and then we can get to some of these questions. These are just some general shelter or general best practices. And I'll make sure folks can access this PowerPoint after the fact too. And also just one final note here before we start taking questions. This was a system of rights synthesized by, not this meme, this is a Simpsons meme, but the text at the bottom was synthesized by some Houston area organizations, and it basically just specifies that every community must have the right to leave, the right to stay, the right to equal treatment, and the right to have a say. And I just think that that's an important note to end on in terms of the importance of communities' self-determination and their ability to decide, if they do want to remain in an area that may be at risk of future disasters, that they have the right to do that. If they would like to leave, they have the right to do that. They do have the right to equal treatment, and they do have a right to have a direct voice in that process that will decide that. And I think that that's just an important thing to say. So that's why I say don't make me tap the sign. If people are getting forcibly removed from anything, I'll tap the sign. And then here's some resources as well. I just wanted to touch on some of these questions. I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. Cool. We got 10 minutes for questions. Cool. Just make sure this didn't end at 5:10. And I was like, oh man, did I just blow through everything? Okay. Cool. Just looking through this here. Raisa, I will be able to send this around, and I do encourage you to drop me a line. Here's my email. People dropping me a line is how I find out about stuff, so please do that. Marsh, you got a hand up? I mean, do you, while I look through these written questions?
Okay, so I want to go back to when you first started talking about FEMA and disasters. I've actually been talking about this in my RAC meetings, and something I'm kind of passionate about. I used to be an instructor for first aid. I used to teach first aid, I used to be an instructor for Red Cross, and I used to teach first aid, CPR, and AED, among other things, for the Red Cross. I'm wondering if, I know that it takes FEMA a while before they actually respond and get to a disaster. They're not always as quick as we would like them to be. And not for the, and they are not at fault for this. It is hard to get to a disaster sometimes. And I know that people are, we're all, when we're in a disaster, we're all trying to help, but we're not all trained. I'm wondering if those of us, and I'm willing to become an instructor again, those of us that are low income, those of us that are homeless, if we were trained, we would be more likely to step up and help in a disaster. We would be more likely to turn to our neighbors and say, can I help you? Do you need water? Do you need food? If somebody needs CPR, do you need first aid? Do you need this? Do you need that? If we were able to offer these in our low income communities, even to our homeless, go up to these homeless camps and offer this training free to them, the CPR, the AED, and the first aid, at least those three. And it's expensive. I checked it out. It used to be, $20. When I taught it, I was able to offer it to because I have 40 plus years as a professional childcare provider, and I taught it to my daycare providers. I was able to offer it to my providers and my parents for $5 because I was able to rent the equipment and go to their providers. I didn't have to have them come to the office or come to Red Cross. This was my way of being able to offer the parents and the providers of low income families for only like $5 or $10. They didn't have to go pay $25 or $30 at the time. This was like 15 years ago when I was still doing daycare. And it was really profitable. The parents were very grateful to only have to pay $5 to learn CPR, AED, and first aid, and not have to pay $25 to go do it, even though it was a 4-hour course. If we could offer this to our low income communities, go into these communities that have, like I have a community center, and I could go to my residents here and say, how many of you are interested in learning this for free? I'll bet I could get 10 to 15 people here in my community that say, yes, I would like to learn this, especially parents of children that don't have this training. If they could get it for free, I guarantee you they would take it.
Yeah.
And then they have the training for a disaster also.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a great idea, and something that we've been kind of looking at is given that lack of the lack of support often for lower income communities, it does fall on people in those low income communities to do a lot of that work. And I think it is so important to have folks with that expertise that are willing to share it. And I'd say that that'd be something to like talk to your, like, that'd be something to talk to, call your like Office of Emergency Management and say, hey, I'm willing to do this. Can we get a series together? Because the local emergency management folks love that stuff because it takes some heat off them and stuff off their plates. And it's a very inclusive thing, especially to do that within the community themselves. So, you know, I've been thinking a lot about like how we can tie skills like these and just information like these to like ongoing, like, you know, or tenant organizing, you know, efforts and things like that, about how we can kind of tie in a lot of the economic and housing justice stuff that we're currently working on with both the practical knowledge of skills like what you were talking about, as well as, you know, a broader knowledge of like how this disaster stuff is going to go. So
I don't know what the American Red Cross requires, but I do know, I mean, I don't know what the American Heart Association requires, but I do know the American Red Cross requires that you already have CPR and first aid training before you take the instructor's course. So with that said, it's going to be, it's like, I think about $60 to take that course. And then it's, I think she said, I don't have my notes right in front of me because it's twice as much. I think it's about $300 to take the instructor's course. So with that said, if we got a bunch of people together and we went to the Red Cross and we said, this is why we're doing it, and why we're doing it is because we need to all be educated and trained for this reason, and we're doing it for low-income communities, there's a possibility we could get the Red Cross to give us a break on the cost. They may even say, you know what, you get enough people together, we'll do it for free.
Yep. I'd say that's a great idea.
And I'm willing to even head something like that here in Oregon, here in the Portland metro area. I would be willing to step up and head something like that if I got enough people in different agencies saying, yay, let's do this. I've got one in my agency. I've got one in my agency. You know, if I got 10 or 15 people saying, yes, we want to become instructors and we want to do this for our communities, I'd step up and I'd go to the Red Cross because they know me there. And several people would recognize me and say, okay, Marsh, let's see what we can do for you.
Excellent. Well, drop your info in the chat box. See if any Oregonians take you up on that.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I just wanted to get to Alfredo's question in the chat. It says, if the CDBG-DR program takes as long as 6 years as you stated, is it likely that some states that receive multiple disaster declarations in different years may have more than one application plan awaiting approval? And I'll say that at least in the case of Louisiana right now, is that it's one action plan for all of those disasters. So they are able to streamline it a little bit in terms of not making you reinvent the wheel specifically for each and every disaster. But honestly, that the reason it is that way is because money was so slow to get out for Hurricanes Laura and Delta that Hurricane Ida had already occurred, you know, before those funds came out. So they knew that they were going to be providing the state of Louisiana with additional funds. So it's kind of like a blessing and a curse on that one, but that is the way it typically works out. Is they'll approve, you know, plans for multiple disasters there, or at least allow you to very easily update your plans. Cool. Does anybody else have any thoughts?
Can you respond to Ariana's question of?
Oh yeah, about collecting CDBG-DR. Can you talk a little bit about how this data is gathered? Talking about FEMA stuff, right? Or just like CDBG-DR in general?
Well, both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We wanted to know about both because one of the things that we're seeing is the looming question of what's happening with people being relocated with CDBG-DR funds. And it would be like amazing to have something similar to what Chico has. Where did they got that they get
So I
that
think
data?
I think that was just a self-survey fill out, or it was either that or a mobile like using telephone signals from Paradise out to those additional areas, but I can find that article and I can send that over to you. Yeah, that was the first time that I had seen something like that before, so that's incredibly useful. But yeah, other than that, I think FEMA's just probably starting to kind of collect information on that. Maybe there's a way we could infer it if we had access to the PII data, you know, the personally identifiable information, we could make those assumptions.
For people who aren't familiar with this whole process, the data is critical, and you really have to go fight for it. I mean, my learning experience was Sandy, and we filed dozens of state freedom of information requests to get the state to kick out the information that they had from HUD and FEMA and what they were doing with the money. So if you don't have the data, you can't contest it. That whole Texas discrimination finding by HUD was based upon data.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Cool. Let me just make a general plug for our Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition Working Group. Coalition. Here is some additional information from NLIHC, and we are at time. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening to me prattle on about disaster recovery. As always, please feel free to drop me a line if you have any questions. Happy to answer it. And we'll go from there. So talk to you all soon.